So this one's a little bit different for me, because it's not the sort of subject I usually talk about, but I have been interested in it the last few days, and I think it deserves some commentary, or rather, I'd like to make some commentary, if I could put it that way, because I think there are a lot of interesting talking points around this. And that is the coughing scandal on the popular quiz show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So the scandal itself occurred in 2001, so we're talking 19 years ago now, but this has been reignited because of a new ITV drama that's been made. It aired a few nights ago. I missed it on television itself because I'm not very good at tuning in. The only TV I tend to watch is the news or the occasional documentary. I rarely watch anything on TV other than the news or documentaries, or if I'm watching a DVD, because I don't have the discipline at the moment to tune in at that precise time. But anyway, because I'm distracted by lots of other things. But I decided this one looked quite interesting, so I decided to download the ITV app. Hope there's no hidden cost with that. But anyway, I watched the program, and it was simply entitled Quiz. And it was about this event where in 2001, this show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, was still relatively new. It was about 2.5, 3 years old at that point. Very popular. It had really changed the landscape of British television in some ways. It was a hugely popular show. I remember watching a lot of episodes. It was a real staple of, I was going to say Saturday night TV, but this was held every night. Originally presented by Chris Tarrant, now by Jeremy Clarkson. But basically, there was a guest by the name of Major Charles Ingram who appeared, and he won £1 million. And he became, I believe, only the second winner of that cash sum, which was an enormous amount 20 years ago. Today, it's still a huge amount, but back then it was unprecedented for a British talk show. I think any talk show to give out such a massive amount of money. Previously, it had been kind of, if you remember, like the 90s generation game, it was things like they'd hand out sort of little novelty phones and the teddy bears and maybe a holiday here and there, but a cash prize of £1 million was really quite revolutionary. Um, so this dramatization, directed by James Graham, well, he's the playwright, looks at this event, and what's interesting about it is its ambiguity. So everyone who's familiar with the case, and it's a pretty well documented case. It was covered all the tabloids back in 2001 until September the 11th, because this actually occurred 2 days before the attacks in New York City and Washington D.C. Um, so it was basically dominating the tabloids up to that point in this country, um, because it was such a bizarre situation where a serving army officer was accused, along with his wife, of being part of an elaborate scheme to cheat the producers out of this £1 million. And the rationale for this was that they had used, or rather, the argument that this had happened was because there was audible coughing heard in the studio audience, and the theory is, or the argument is, that this was used as part of an elaborate mechanism to indicate the right answers to Major Ingram, who himself was not particularly interested in game shows. And his mannerisms throughout the broadcasts were a bit unusual. What's interesting is it wasn't all on one night, it was actually over 2 or 3 nights. When we watch quiz shows at home, or any shows, we assume that it's all done at once. But I guess any of these sort of shows, and I don't watch many of them, but I did watch You Want to Be a Millionaire. There's an assumption it's all on the same night, but that's not the case. It's also significant. There's some things that I didn't realize. That original show didn't actually air. Most people think they're familiar with it because what actually happened was clips of it or segments of it were showed in a documentary made a couple of years later. Now, I've tried to find that documentary again because I know I've watched it before. Unfortunately, it's been taken down. And I think the reason it's been taken down is because the Ingrams are now trying to pursue a fresh appeal against their conviction. and their conviction actually formally was the procurement. Let me get this right. Just getting the precise. Procuring the execution of a valuable security by deception. This was at Southwark Crown Court. Now, there is a lot of things to say around this, so bear with me because there's a lot of things I want to say. So, I have seen that documentary. I wanted to watch it again, but it's been taken down. I have seen it though. It's all about the background and when the production team realised or they felt that something was amiss. I've watched the show Quiz. It's in 3 parts. I thought it was very good. It stars, by the way, Matthew McFadden, and Sean Clifford, who I must admit I wasn't familiar with her work, but they were excellent. Also, Michael Sheen, who is previously known for playing Tony Blair in The Queen, among other things. A few interesting footnotes about the production itself. Matthew McFadden or McFadden, I'm not quite sure how his name's pronounced. But anyway, the first thing I saw him in was actually a drama. I believe it was a BBC drama called Warriors back in 1999, in which he was playing a working class soldier from Liverpool who was serving as a UN peacekeeper in Bosnia. And that dramatization was about the Bosnian War and about British peacekeepers, also Sir Ewan Griffith and Damian Lewis. Now, what's interesting, it's just kind of a full circle in a sense because he is now playing a very middle class army major, and in that production, he was playing a working class private. So that's just an interesting observation. It's got no relevance to the scandal, but it's just one of those things you notice when you look at the work of actors. Also, Ellen McCrory plays their defense attorney. I think they've changed her name in the production, but that's kind of interesting. Interesting, I'll say, because she also started Cherie Blair in The Queen alongside Michael Sheen, who plays Chris Tarrant in this. So that's kind of a little connection. Um, I have to say, though, all the leads I was very impressed by. It was incredible work. Chris Tarrant himself has said that he liked Sheen's performance because he's an actor, he's not an imitator. I thought it was really good casting, and I thought they all three done a very good job. I mean, literally, they must have studied that original footage minutely because it's literally gesture for gesture. For example, Diane Ingram, there's a point near where her husband got the million, where she's kind of got this sort of expression. She's her head in her hands and her hands are shaking. That was done literally. It was incredible. Very, very well done. So I enjoyed the production. I thought it was, and what I liked about it was ambiguous. It wasn't fully saying, oh well, they're definitely innocent. It wasn't getting into conspiracy theory. It's just saying that there may be more to this than people think they know about the original case. So I've taken a few notes actually for this one because I want to cover a lot of things, and I've been looking into it. I've seen interviews. Chris Tarrant had an interview with Good Morning Britain via video link, of course. Of course, the whole coughing thing now takes a new dimension with coronavirus. And I've just seen an interview with Sean Clifford, Sian Clifford. Apologies if I'm pronouncing names wrong in this. And she actually said that James Graham was very interested in the show. And what's interesting is that there's a sort of juxtaposition about truth and transparency coming from about that time onwards, because of course it was September the 11th. And although it's got the attacks of that time were nothing to do with this scandal, they did inevitably bring them into the show, but probably they couldn't have avoided that because obviously that was the only news on that day. So it kind of showed how the production company, Celador, and ITV and the Ingrams were all wrapped up in this sort of issue, and then suddenly everyone sees what's happening on TV, and their predicament seems almost trivial by comparison. And what's interesting in the film, they show the prosecution lawyer saying, "What's the big deal? It's just a quiz show, right? But take away all the lights, take away all the attention from that, and what you basically have is theft." So, in other words, if you had burglars or robbers who stole £1 million from a bank, they would be considered serious criminals. So fundamentally, if the Ingrams were guilty and they plotted to basically take this 1 million by deception, it's theft. So that was the argument the prosecution made. Now, I thought about both sides of this, and like I say, I've watched that documentary, I've watched the show quiz. The Ingrams are now issuing a fresh appeal, which is interesting. Their lawyer is adamant that they're innocent as well. They've always maintained their innocence. Now, I think that says one of two things. It either says that they're just compulsive liars, or they genuinely believe that this was a miscarriage of justice, and it was an extraordinary set of circumstances that led to them being convicted. Um, so I'm going to look at kind of both sides of this because I personally am still quite divided on this. So the defense argued, or the defense pointed out, have pointed out that the entire case basically came down, or the entire prosecution case came down to something called tape G. This is the edited version of the original broadcast, which kind of accentuated or highlighted the coughs from this character, Tecwen Whittock, who in the TV adaptation is implied him and Charles Ingram never met. But basically, it said that he was part of this kind of shadowy group. Um, I forget the name now, consortium, and they were kind of people who were super nerds on quiz shows, and they kind of worked out this elaborate technique to try and rig their people to get them into the show. So Tecwen Whittock was allegedly part of that. Now, the defense pointed out that a lot of the prosecution rested on this business about coughing. That is to say that Tecwen Whittock and Diana Ingram were coughing when Charles Ingram named the right answers. Now that's problematic because that tape G, and I believe Celador's admitted this, was only highlighting the coughs by Tecwen Whittock. It wasn't highlighting all the coughs that night. And apparently, and Chris Tarrant even suggested this, or stated this, in a studio, whether it's some sort of group dynamic or something, there was 192 coughs recorded. And yet everyone's only familiar with those ones that happen to be on the right answers. Now, what's been pointed out is that actually there were also coughs on the night that the first winner won. I forget her name now, but no one raised suspicions about her win. Yet there was also coughs when she gave the right answers, and yet it's only been highlighted in this case against the Ingrams. Um, there are certainly a lot of things that don't add up, and I think at the time one of the things the defense has pointed out is that technology did not exist at the time that may now be um, highlight, for example, the nature of the coughing that was going on and the sequence of events that implicated the Ingrams. So I'm going to try and do this in as ordered a way as possible. So I've just got notes here and there's a lot to point out. So the fact those cheating coughs, so-called cheating coughs, were enhanced. Um, The footage shows when you see the original footage of Diana Ingram, I would say her body language is certainly very suggestive in the sense that she looks very nervous, as you would expect when her husband's doing so well. She keeps looking at down to Tecwen Whittock as if thinking, is he going to make that cough? I would say her mannerisms are probably the strongest implication because they are a bit strange. And there's one point where she sort of says, "Oh, don't do it." And that could just be the nervous wife, sort of like he doesn't know, so he shouldn't take the gamble. Or it could be that you're going too far because this can implicate our plot. You know, you're going to get us exposed, basically. A lot of people have said if the Ingrams had kind of stuck with 125,000 or maybe even 500,000, they could have got away with it. But the fact that he played right up to 1 million was the mistake. Um, there is some things that stand out for me. Looking at questions, I've watched the entire original broadcast tonight. Looking at the questions, some of the one so-called easy questions I didn't know. So in that sense, maybe I've got a brain like Major Ingram's in that I knew some of the things that sorry, I didn't know some of the things that he also didn't know. So everyone keeps talking about that Craig David question like it's so easy. Well, I know Craig David was a big star in the early 2000s, and maybe at that time it was common knowledge. I didn't know the answer to that. I didn't know the answer to the Coronation Street one. I would have got those wrong. So I would have used the same strategy of using one of my lifelines probably for those. If you don't watch something, how can you know the answer? And yet the supposedly the question marks are raised because he got correct answers on the so-called harder questions. Now, honestly, I knew a lot of the historical and geography ones because I just know that I have a particularly strong knowledge of that sort of stuff. I knew the Baron Haussmann one, I knew the Normans one, I knew the a lot of the others because I just happened to have a big interest in history and geography. So if I were in that situation, I'm just thinking personally here, people would say, how can this guy not get some question about, I don't know, X Factor or something like that? But he knows a certain American state located in whatever it may be. So I think it's unfair to judge someone on not knowing popular culture because not everyone has the same interests. Um, Tecwen Whittock apparently had an actual health problem, which meant that he was an incessant cougher. Now, this is one of the things that was used for the defense, because this was proven that he did, in fact, have a health problem. Why would the Ingrams rely on someone? Why would they rely on someone who has a coughing problem cough at the right moment? That certainly gets you thinking, because he would be unreliable. He would be coughing intermittently. He would be coughing at the wrong answers and the right answers. So I think that certainly raises questions. Um, it's also worth pointing out the founder or the leader of this so-called consortium, which is quite played up in the dramatization, like they're quite, and it also shows Diana Ingram had something to do with that, but Charles Ingram didn't. Now that's quite played up. The founder of that, Paddy, a guy called Paddy Spooner, um, basically said his character in the production. I don't know if this is true or not to real life, but the producer of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire met up with him, slightly tense conversation as you can imagine, and he said, "Yeah, we did. We were successful in pulling the wool over your eyes for a long time, and we probably got up to 10% of all the winnings up to that point." But he poignantly said, "But we had nothing to do with the Ingrams. They weren't with us." So the guy now maybe that's a protection thing. It's interesting that he's never been prosecuted because surely this consortium would have been up to some dodgy stuff. But that brings me to the next point. The Ingrams themselves. It's very strange to me that both Diana Ingram and her brother had both appeared on the show. So three members of the same family all appearing on the same show over a relatively short period of time. I don't think that would be possible today, and it's quite remarkable that that happened back then. Now, if it wasn't against the rules, they weren't breaking the rules. It's a little bit of a coincidence. Um, Diana Ingram was a quiz show enthusiast, so it makes sense that she would have a reasonable chance of getting on if she was very perseverant. Both her and the brother won 34,000. With, with Major Ingram, what I think stands out is he doesn't come across as exceptionally smart. To me, he seems about average. He was getting some of the questions right. His way of thinking was fairly logical. Some of them he clearly didn't know. Um, So he comes across to me. I know some have said he's kind of like a Tim Nice but Dim type character. I don't think so. I think he's relatively smart. That's how he comes across to me, um, based on interviews and so on. It's also worth pointing out, incidentally, that Charles Ingram is a bit of a, how can I say, not reality TV star per se, but he's been on other shows. Anyway, I'll come to that after. So, yeah, that's just an interesting point to raise. So we know that there were things going on that night that weren't known at the time, that were not brought up, or not in the public knowledge. I do feel that the Ingrams had something of a trial by media. And this is shown in the show, actually, in the program, where you have all the press, behaving in a pretty obnoxious way, as they often do, just swarming outside the Ingrams house. It also shows some upsetting scenes, for example, where their children get bullied at school. They get eggs thrown at the car. There's one really unpleasant scene where their little dog is killed by some, nasty people, presumably as sort of like a rebuke to to the major. In the film, they had to use a dog. In real life, it was a cat because Matthew McFadden's allergic to cats, apparently. And he was also spat at. Apparently, that's all true. That did happen. In the production, it shows him being spat at, and it's pretty unpleasant. Some yob spits in his face, and then he angrily confronts the guy. So the Ingrams were kind of made hate figures in a sense. And there is a very ugly side to that, which Matthew McFadden's commented on, that there is this British tendency. On one hand, Major Ingram fits a lot of British stereotypes, the very polite, very pleasant, sort of middle class, middle England type character. And yet there's this ugly side where the backlash against the Ingrams, people just want to cut them down. And there's a telling bit at the end of the program where they sort of say, "Well, if we're guilty, why are we not going to jail?" And I think that leaves a sort of ambiguous question mark. So on the other side, the Ingrams are definitely, there is a lot of question marks around them, and there's no escaping from that. Shortly after this trial, for which they were found guilty, but they got, I believe, a suspended sentence, they had to pay £15,000 each. Charles Ingram was found guilty of an insurance fraud. Okay, so that's another legal case unrelated to the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire thing. And this is what it says. From the Wikipedia article, in late 2003, Ingram and his wife were charged with further fraud offences. On the 28th of October, Ingram was found guilty at Bournemouth Crown Court of obtaining a pecuniary advantage by deception and of a second charge of deception, having attempted to claim on an insurance policy after an alleged burglary at his home. Ingram had failed to tell Direct Line Insurance about claims he had made in the 3 years before he took out the policy in July 2001. The court was told that Ingram had been a habitual claimant with Norwich Union after suffering unfortunate losses of private possessions. Christopher Parker, prosecuting, said Ingram switched insurers to Zurich Insurance Group in 1997 after Norwich Union reduced the burglary claim from £19,000 to £9,000, and in 2000 switched again to Direct Line. He has been ineluctably dishonest, Parker said. He went to Direct Line and didn't make a. Ingram was given a conditional discharge on the charge of fraudulently claiming £30,000 on insurance. The judge told Ingram he took into account the punishment Ingram had brought upon himself and his dire financial strait, and rejected an alternative option of community service after Ingram told a probation officer he feared other criminals would bully him. Um, so a lot of people might look at that and think, well, this guy, okay, he might have been innocent to the millionaire thing, but he's guilty of another offence. So there seems to be a pattern here. But like I say, he's become something of a reality TV star. He appeared on The Weakest Link. In fact, they both did, which I find quite incredible. Any other quiz show would permit them to appear. After that, that was in 2003. And then he also appeared on Wife Swap. Well, they both did, where he swapped places with Jade Goody and her boyfriend. So, or he lived with Jade Goody, and Diana Ingram lived with Jade's boyfriend, which was, you could tell why they were cast that way. It was clearly a class thing, that's the middle class major and his wife with the working class reality TV star. It was very much, yeah. So I think part of the problems that the Ingrams have is they're kind of, in a way, at a disadvantage with their perception, because I think there's a vindictiveness out there with the Ingrams, and I'm not saying they're innocent. I'll get to that in a minute, but they are quite eccentric. You know, I think Charles Ingram is, in particular, seen as quite an eccentric character, and so his methodology in answering the questions, it just seemed to implicate him. And there is one point, I think it was the question on Baron Houseman, where his wife coughs because Tecwen Whittock didn't at that point, and she's heard to say no. Now, to me, that might be the most damning evidence of all. Regarding the prosecution side of things, Chris Tarrant himself has got into a war of words with Charles Ingram. Charles Ingram has accused Tarrant of attacking him now because Tarrant has said that at the time he felt that he didn't notice anything. It's only afterwards he came to the conclusion that they're guilty of sin because he spent hours and hours watching footage with prosecution or with fraud officers. There are a lot of things about this case that don't add up. I think it's somewhat problematic that the claimants or the I don't know what the legal term would be, but the people making the charge of being defrauded and they cancelled the check incidentally, they were allowed to produce the evidence. Now that seems to me to be quite extraordinary. Um, they were allowed to produce expert evidence. Now, if that's not bias, I don't know what is. As the Ingram's defense lawyer said, that there was a sort of gentleman's agreement that they hadn't tampered with the evidence, but a gentleman's agreement can't be used in a court of law. Um, the no cough on that £500,000 question certainly raises questions. There was also another fastest finger first person, a guy called Larry Whitehurst, who famously, if you know the case, refused to sort of stand up and clap when Ingram won the 1 million because he has said in the documentary, the one that's now been taken down, that he was looking at Tecwen Whittock the whole time and he was very suspicious about what was going on. In the TV production of Quiz, their defense lawyer puts to him that he was just basically bitter about the fact he didn't get to be in the hot seat. Who knows? Um, Chris Tarrant's own justification for him now believing that the Ingrams were guilty was that his rationale is that with most contestants, when they went from 500,000 to 1 million, they'd really agonized over that decision. With Charles Ingram, he didn't, he just went straight to it. Now, to me, that's not evidence. It's unusual, but I think that's speculative on Tarrant's part. He can't say that's evidence the man cheated. So, one thing I find about this case and why it's so intriguing and ambiguous is a lot of the things that are held up as evidence that they are definitely guilty strike me as being circumstantial. There is actually, apart from Diana Ingram's no during a cough, which definitely raises scrutiny, there is actually very little solidly proving the Ingram's guilt. You know, this is not like a case where, let's say, you had a murder and the murder weapon had the DNA of the suspect. This is something where conjecture really is quite strong with a lot of this. The fact that there was an underground sort of group called the Consortium, the fact that Diana Ingram and her brother had appeared on the show, the fact there was coughing at the right moments, all those things certainly would seem to damn the Ingrams. But it is interesting that to this day they have maintained their innocence. During that wife swap thing, Diana Ingram was even being mocked by, people coughing in the background. So the Ingrams have been totally vilified in some ways. Um, and I can't help but feel, apart from this, like up until now, the entire narrative has been biased against them. I mean, that documentary, they weren't interviewed. It was entirely one-sided, and it was all from the point of view of the production team, i.e., this is what we think happened. So, to conclude, I just don't know. I think that's why this is such an interesting case. Those people who are saying, oh, he's guilty as hell. Now, I appreciate that Chris Tarrant's in obviously a different position than I am. He was there, he was right there, and he's looked through the footage. Um, but it does seem that Tarrant's leaving a lot of his feelings on this because of what happened afterwards. Now, for his part, Charles Ingram's accused Chris Tarrant of trying to protect his legacy. One person who was there that night, who's now a journalist, said that Tarrant was quite hostile to Ingram on the night, and I do think that Tarrant was a little bit. It came across like he was trying to be professional and keep his cool, but it kind of looked like he was a bit iffy with Charles Ingram. Like he was talking to him in very disrespectful ways, like old Major and doing faulty impressions and stuff. It may have just been Tarrant's personality. I don't know, but there is a lot about this case, a lot that raises some interesting questions. Now, ultimately, it's certainly by no means the worst crime. It's theft if they were indeed guilty. But is it a victimless crime? Because okay, the company was down by £1 million, I guess you could say, and they were left red faced. But it's not like the Ingrams, mugged off some old lady of her life savings. It's not like they done something that hurt the average person, really. So I just don't know about this one. I must admit that before that show quiz, I would have thought, yeah, they were, they were guilty. But after the quiz, I think there is some room for ambiguity. And I do think that a lot of the problem with the original trial was there was something of a trial by media. Apparently, in the courtroom, for example, jurors were coughing in jest. Now, if that's true, that would indicate that there was strong bias against the Ingrams, not helped by the media. So the fact that they're saying this to this day, that they are innocent, it's a very, very long time to be that stubborn if they know that they were guilty. So either they're compulsive liars, or it could even be that they did cheat and they've just convinced themselves that they didn't. Like they've kind of convinced themselves that what they done was legitimate. So I just don't know. I do think something like this, though, people need to be open minded and look at every aspect of this, and that's what I've tried to do. I just don't know. I mean, after watching the show quiz, I definitely veered towards they could well be innocent. I would say 70%. Watching interviews with Chris Tarrant and others, I'm not so sure now. Maybe I'm back to 50-50. Maybe they did well cheat. So, what do you think? Have you seen Quiz? Did you see the original? Did you see the documentary? What do you think of this and why? I know this is a long video, but I think it's an interesting one.